behind organizing this kind of an interdisciplinary program is to foster learning and deliberation on important issues from a multidisciplinary perspective. Because as we all know, different disciplines have different approaches and methodologies of dealing with a particular issue. And it's only through exchange of ideas and opinions that we can create a more holistic picture. This FDP has tried to focus on the dynamics of different forms of human mobility and the consequent ideological and cultural transformations over time. We have had very eminent speakers from different disciplines who have talked and deliberated on this issue. And today, we are extremely happy and honored to have amongst us Dr. Parjanya, who is presently working as Assistant Professor in English at Deshbandhu College for Girls, Kolkata. His topic of discussion today is Revisiting Bhot Bagaan, Tibetan Pilgrimage and Indian Ascetics in the 18th Century. I would just give you a very brief introduction of our speaker. Dr. Shane obtained his PhD in 2021 from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He has worked under the supervision of Professor Tapati Guha on Buddhist reconfigurations in 19th and early 20th century Bengal, with focus on Tibet and the Himalayan borderlands. He received the Ashok Mitra Award for Best PhD Thesis in 2021 from the center. In 2023, Dr. Shane was selected as one of the 5 global early career research fellows by the American Council of Learned Societies. He was funded by the Robert H. Ho Family Foundation Program in Buddhist Studies for a period of 10 months between December 2023 and September 2024 to work on a monograph project from his thesis. During the tenure of this fellowship program, Dr. Sen was affiliated as a postdoctoral visiting scholar at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography, University of Oxford. Mentored by Professor Claire E. Harris during this period, he was working in the various archives in the United Kingdom and is presently in the final stages of writing out his book. Dr. Sen delivered an invited lecture from his work-in-progress monograph at the Department of South Asian, Tibetan, and Buddhist Studies at the University of Vienna on 18th April 2024. Dr. Sen was also selected as one of 4 fellows by ACLS for a monograph retreat and workshop at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, and is now being mentored by Professor Donald Lopez of the University of Michigan for his book. He is also the director of a 2-year ICSSR major research project on Buddhist sacred sites in the Western Himalayan regions of Spiti, Lahaul, and Kinnaur, and the monastic cult of Lotsawa Rincheng Zangpo. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it correct or not. Dr. Sen has also published an edited volume, Death and Dying in Northeast India, Indigeneity and Afterlife, that has been published by Routledge in 2023. He has also given several other talks across colleges and universities in both India and abroad. Dr. Sen, we are extremely happy to have you here with us today, and it's now over to you.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction to me and my work. Am I audible? Yeah, I will just sort of turn on the PowerPoint and is my screen visible?
Everything is
visible.
Okay. And Kush, please feel free to stop me whenever, if something goes wrong, either the slide is not visible or my voice is not audible, just feel free to stop.
I shall.
So thank you once again. I thank the Cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, and I thank Surendranath College for Women for having me today, for inviting me to give this talk. The presentation I'm going to give today is about a lesser known site very close to Calcutta, very close to Howrah. A lot of us may already be familiar with this site. We are going to revisit this site and we are going to see how the linkages worked between Bengal and Tibet in the 18th century. So I've titled my presentation as Revisiting Bhot Bagaan, Tibetan Pilgrimage and Indian Ascetics in the 18th Century. A few miles north of Calcutta, on the banks of the river Hooghly in Ghushuri, Howrah, stands a structure that remains among the few surviving debris of an early moment in the Anglo-Tibet encounter. It is called the Bhot Bagan Monastery. The term Bhot or Byo meaning Tibet. Okay, that's the term from where the name comes. That's Bodh or Bhod. It basically translates as Tibet. Established in the 1780s, it stands on 150 bighas of land, now largely encroached, leased to the Panchen Lama by the British India government through Warren Hastings, the then Governor General of Bengal. Within this dilapidated structure is contained a material cultural trace of this encounter, a sacred memento that was given by the third Panchen Lama, Lobsang Palden Yeshe. That's his spelling in Tibetan, and his dates are 1738 to 1780. This token, this cultural trace, was given by Lobsang Palden Yeshe, to the Gosai Purangiri. And this is the figure of Jetsun Drolma or Progya Paramita, which is still there at the site. Accrued onto which are vestiges of an early pre-colonial contact culture between India and Tibet. Inextricably linked to the biography of the monument and this object is the story of the first Mohant or Mohanto and caretaker of Bhot Bagan, the Gosai Purangiri. His dates would be circa 1749 to 1795. Now, these are dates which are kind of retroactively reconstructed by me, because, and I'll be talking about how we are reconstructing his biography. In the biography which we have by Gaurdas Poshak, he mentions that Giri was roughly 25 or around 25 years old when he met Warren Hastings for the first time. That was in 1794. So, sorry, in 1774. So retroactively, you can kind of construct his date of birth and also his the date, the year when he died. That's there in Boshak's biography. He was one of the earliest interlocutors who facilitated an opening up of Tibet to the British. We shall use this figure as our point of entry into investigating how pre-colonial pasts become restructured and reprojected onto newer colonial historiographies and imaginaries through new networks that began operating in the Himalayas in the second half of the 18th century. We shall also analyze how non-white agents, both Indian and Tibetan, became key players within these reconfigurations. Before we come to the Ghushuri monument and the discussion of Purangiri's agency as interlocutor, it may be important to lay out the larger imperial networks within which figures such as the Goshais functioned in the early days of the British Empire. Christopher Bailey, he talks about this idea of empire of information. He talks basically about how the empire was premised based or premised largely on the idea of information exchange and how it relied on a series of these figures, interlocutors figures, whom he refers to as dubhashis, or polyglots rather, who were able to transact in different languages, and also they were able to relay information and knowledge to empires. So it was basically an empire of information. That's Chris Bailey's idea. So drawing upon that, we see how knowledge expansion, and this is Bailey's idea. Bailey talks about how the empire and knowledge was not so much a byproduct of empire, but the condition for it. And Bailey goes on to argue how such a paradigm of imperial knowledge and power relied heavily upon, as I was saying, indigenous agents and actors. I quote Bailey, "In order to create new routes for the regular transmission of information and personnel, the British needed to have access to the great labor force represented by the Harkaras. These Harkaras, literally do all or factotum, where a hierarchy of agents from highly educated to the lowly, from running spies who were of royal households or direct dependents of magnates or British officials, to intelligence communities, organized under headmen or merchant financiers who were employed by anyone who could afford their services, to long distance runners. So basically a motley group of, people. Okay. And this whole idea of the intelligence communities becomes very, very important that Bailey talks about. Bailey's formulation is useful in understanding the multi-pronged role of indigenous agency and its relationality to European information gathering and knowledge production in the early days of the British East India Company. Kapil Raj, in his assessment of the city space of Calcutta in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reads of it as a brokered city. He talks about this idea of cultural brokerage, where the East India Company and its processes of knowledge making vis-a-vis the city was mediated through and facilitated by a range of go-betweens. This is Kapil Raj's words, or cultural brokers. Kapil Raj theorizes that for the East India Company and Hastings, these go-betweens were indispensable to ensure passage between the varied languages, customs, and accounting techniques of the merchants and those of local communities of producers and suppliers. And as I was talking about, such go-betweens would often range across a series of agents or characters, from dubhashis to sharafs or money changers, to dalals to baniyas, and basically a host of agents. Information communities, according to Bailey, go-betweens or cultural brokers, according to Kapil Raj. Um, Kapil Raj's formulations help us in approaching these figures of the Goshais. Purangiri Gosai, we'll be talking a lot about him today, who operated within existing pilgrimage and trade network in the Himalayas and its foothills. Belonging to what Bailey describes as intelligence communities, their roles as cultural brokers would become an indispensable asset to the British Raj. Now, who were the Gosains? Okay, sorry. Who were the Gosains? The Gosains were collectively also known as the Aksharas in Tibet and had served to reinvigorate Tibetan configurations of India as sacred land that had been initiated by the visit of the Natha yogi Buddhagupta Nath to Tibet from northeast India towards the close of the 16th century. Now, this is an idea that Tony Huber talks about in his book called The Holy Land Reborn. Basically, even after Buddhism dies out from mainland India, there are continued kind of exchange and traffic between India and Tibet. One of the figures is Buddhagupta Nath. His dates are 1514 to 1610. And Taranath also talks about Buddhagupta Nath. And through Buddhagupta Nath, this idea of the Natha Siddha tradition and pilgrimage sites, which were basically Hindu pilgrimage sites, they also entered into a Tibetan sacred configuration. And this was further carried on by these figures of the Gosais, or the Atsaras, as described by Tony Huber, who were traveling between, they were mostly from Uttar Pradesh, that area, which is what is present-day Uttarakhand. The Dasnami sannyasis, I'll just be talking about them. They were the most important sects. Their main center is Joshimath. They were constantly traveling between Tibet and India. And, it is through them, and earlier through Buddhagupta Natha, how sites such as the Nagar That, the Hinglaj, Haridwar, Lucknow, Prayag, Gangasagar, Jagannath, all of these enter into a Tibetan sacred imagination of India. And, if one reads Huber's book, you will see how even within Lama Taranatha's writing, you will find a lot of references to what are essentially Hindu or Brahmanical pilgrimage sites. And all of these enter into Tibetan sacred imagination also. So the Gosais, en route their journey to the Kailash Mansarovar, would halt at the court of the Panchen Lama in Tashi Lunpo. And it was Lobsang Paldeng Yeshe, the third Panchen Lama, who used these Goshais or Atsaras to open up direct diplomatic and cultural negotiations with the Indian monarchs and later the British in the 18th century. So it was through the Goshais that the third Panchen Lama, Lobsang Paldeng Yeshe, I just showed you his, sorry. Yeah, that's him, Lobsang Paldeng Yeshe. His dates are 1730 to 1780. That's the Tibetan spelling. He was the one who, through these Goshais, managed to reinvigorate the diplomatic ties, first with Raja Chait Singh, we'll talk about him, of Banaras, and later with Warren Hastings. We'll see how that happens. Purangiri belonged to the Tarokeshwar Mandali of the Dasanami sannyasis, Shaivites and followers of Shankaracharya of the 10th century CE. They constituted perhaps one of the most powerful and influential monastic orders in northern India. According to Ananda Bhattacharya, thus Dashnami means 10 names: Giri, Puri, Bharati, Arunno, Ban, Saraswati, Tirtha, Ashram, Shagor, and Parbut. They were commonly known as the Goshais or Goshais, settled and married sannyasis. They're settled and married and Nagas. Okay. And but I'll just quote from Bhattacharya. The sannyasis had old trade links with Nepal, Tibet, and Bhutan. They used to export gold, silver, Bengal cloth, raw silk, and import Tibetan products such as musk, tinkle, etc. via Nepal and Benares to different parts of Hindustan. The sannyasis also established trade links between Bengal and Tibet. In this context, the role of Purangiri in bringing minerals such as gold, gold dust, and silver from Tibet deserves mention. The Dasanami sannyasis were far more than mere monastic figures. They were not just ascetic figures, they were micro traders. In many ways, this is what Bailey is talking about in different contexts, of course, information community. So when you look at the Gosais, they're different things. They're not just ascetics, they're also, in that sense, intelligence communities. They were micro traders, besides being amateur travelers, explorers, and polyglots. At a time when the British had not yet managed to bring the Himalayan trade routes within their influence and control, these sannyasis proved to be an extremely important intelligence community that could be recruited in the service of empire to gather information for the British colonial officers and become part of the processes of early colonial knowledge compilation. Shujoy Dash, he was also one of my juniors at the center and has written a very good ample pieces on the Dashnami sannyasis. He has studied how the worlds of monasticism and mercantile interests were straddled simultaneously by these sannyasis, and how their establishments, the matha or the mott, became centers of immense wealth and power. Shujoy Das writes that in addition to their monastic life, the Dasnamis also emerged as zamindars on landlords, conducted various trade and business, and served as parts of local and British army and espionage networks. So you see, they're not just ascetics in that sense. Das evaluates how the Giri sannyasis were especially powerful figures in the 18th century who had sufficient sway over northern and eastern India, the Deccan, and parts of Nepal. Although their headquarters was based in Jhansi, I told you they're mainly operating from what is presently Uttarakhand, but what was at that point of time Uttar Pradesh, and in a kind of contiguous with Nepal and the mountainous tracts of Nepal, heads right into Tibet. Although their headquarters was based in Jhansi, where they maintained an armed retinue, their matts or mathas were spread across various places such as Banaras, Mirzapur, Nagpur, Pune, Bengal, and Nepal. Not only the British, but also Indian Nawabs such as Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Oudh, from 1754 to 1775, would come to depend greatly on the Giri sannyasis. By the middle of the 18th century, the Giri sannyasis of the Tarokeshwar sect had emerged as potent and powerful actors across Bengal and Bihar. As outlined, the Giris were regular visitors to the court of the Panchan Lama at Tashilumpo. Just give me a second, I'll have some water. Am I audible? And is my presentation visible?
Ekdam. It's fine.
Take it. Thanks, Kush. So as outlined, as I was, just
Yeah.
indicating, Panchan Lama depended greatly on the Giri sannyasi, on the Giri Gosains, and we'll see how the third Panchan Lama, he was one of the earliest Tibetan figures in the 18th century who would use this mercantile community, this ascetic figures, in order to strike up diplomatic relations with Indian monarchs and later with Warren Hastings. We'll see how that happens. As outlined, the Giris were regular visitors to the court of the Panchan Lama at Tashilumpo. Towards the second half of 1771, the third Panchen Lama, Lobsang Palden Yeshe, had been visited by the Acharya Sukhdev Giri, who presented him with a pair of European spectacles. According to the Tibetan hagiographical sources that include the Namthar of or life of the Panchen Lama. Now, before I proceed, I just want to quickly unpack this word, Namthar or Nampar Tharpa, which basically has been translated as hagiography, but it basically means life, okay? And this is the main sort of Tibetan source for constructing, the history of this period. It's called Jeblama Ji Suggyan Panchen Thamchad Khenpa Lobzang Palden Yeshe Palzang Poi Jalnag Naski Nampar Tharpa Nima Ozer Zebyapa, which basically means the Guru Lama's crown ornament of world omniscient one, Lobsang Palden Yeshe's biographical account known as Sunlight. Nima means sunlight. Okay, so the Namthars, whenever we are looking at Tibetan sources, this is the most important source from that particular period, not just for looking at the Panchen Lama's story, but most kind of histories of that period in India or in Tibet. The main source is Nambar Tharpa or Namthar. Okay, that's just a digression, not directly linked to the main kind of content of our talk today, but I just wanted to put that across to you. Okay, anyway. So let's continue. According to Tibetan hagiographical sources that include the Namthar or the life of the third Panchen Lama, which was translated by Sharat Chandra Das and later by L. Pitek, the Lama had been keen on sending monks and emissaries to visit the Buddhist holy sites in India. I just told you that, through Buddha Gupta Natha and later through the Natha Siddha tradition, a lot of what were basically Hindu kind of pilgrimage sites entered into the Tibetan kind of sacred imagination of India. And if you want to know more about this, Tony Hubert talks a great deal about this in his book, The Holy Land Reborn. So Huber has examined the different contours through which India, as sacred topos or sacred land, continued to inflect Tibetan imaginaries in both real and idealized terms through a complex of common ritual activities and often popular narrative discourses that Tibetans themselves invested in India over a long period of time. Such imaginaries congealed around the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya, referred to as Dorjedan within Tibetan sources. So although, in Hindu sites were important like Gaya, Jagannath, all of these are mentioned in Tibetan sources as well and forms part of the Tibetan pilgrimage network. But the most important site is, of course, Bodh Gaya, which was, called Dorjedan in the Tibetan sources. So Palden Yeshe, the third Panchen Lama, around June-July 1771, sent a monk by the name of Lobsang Chiring or Drun Rempa Lobsang Chiring with offerings and presents to the kings of Nepal and India and also to the Mahabodhi temple site at Bodh Gaya. Lobsang returned in 1772 with letters from the Gurkha king of Nepal and the Raja of Banaras, and was shortly followed by another Acharya, Sughadigiri, who brought the Panchen Lama many rare objects as gifts that included a conch, pearls, and corals, and European eyeglasses. These are all mentioned in the Namthar or the Tibetan source. The Panchen Lama once again sent Lobsang Chiring in 1773 on a pilgrimage to the Mahabodhi temple site, as well as other Hindu-Buddhist sacred religious sites in Prayag, Banaras, and Nairanjana, along with 3 other Tibetan monks. The 3 monks died in India, unable to cope with the burning heat. The venomous snakes, the wild and ferocious animals, and the band of robbers on the road. I'm quoting directly from the translation of the Namthar. Lobsang alone reached the court of the Raja of Banaras, Chait Singh, who recognized the importance of establishing trade relations with Tibet. Lobsang, accompanied by the escorts of the king, visited the holy places in Banaras and Gaya. And there's a small section. I'm not getting into the details of Lobsang's visit. Lobsang returned to Tibet, accompanied by 2 emissaries from Chait Singh, the Gosai Kishanpuri and another Gosai called Shobharam or Soparam. In Tibetan, he's mentioned as Soparam, but the Hindustani name would be Shobharam. They reached Tibet in mid-1774, bearing a letter from Chait Singh and gifts that included a model of the Mahabodhi temple, a watch studded with precious stones, a mirror, tusks of elephant and jade, along with 2 black stone images of Shakyamuni and Maitreya Buddha. As evidenced through these Tibetan records, there existed, and this is the point I want to underscore and highlight, there existed in the mid-18th century active cross-currents of Hindu-Buddhist material cultural circulation between Tibet and India through an exchange of gifts and ritual objects. There also existed pilgrimage networks through the Himalayas, impelled by the Tibetan desire of visiting the sacred sites associated with the life of Siddhartha Buddha. Viewed in this context, the Gosais served as powerful emissaries between Tibet and the independent Hindu kingdoms of northern India. They were not only the bearers of letters, gifts, and ritual objects, but also active agents in facilitating and rekindling of pilgrimage linkages to India's sacred Buddhist sites. It may also be noted here that prior to, this whole idea, what I'm basically trying to hint at is when Warren Hastings come, and I've not yet moved to the British. You will see when we now move to the British, story, you will see that the British are basically kind of, kind of using these existing linkages between Tibet and India. They're tapping into the Goshais. They're using the Goshais as part of, as ways of, consolidating their notions of empire. So it's not like that. It's not like the British kind of established the earliest connections with Tibet. Connections were always already there. Okay. So Purangiri comes out of such a pre-colonial milieu of religious and cultural porosity. His role as the architect of the Bogle mission, we'll just talk about it, of 1774 to 77. The Bogle mission is seen as the earliest kind of mission that was launched from British India to Tibet, and it is seen as the mission, 1774 to 77, that opened up Tibet. Okay, but this is the pretext to the Bogle mission, which I'm giving you. So Purangiri's role as the architect of the Bogle mission of 1774 to 77 and his liaison with the third Panchen Lama of Tibet needs to be read as the story of the superimposition or writing over of these pre-colonial networks of encounter by the meta-text of British colonial historiography. Variously recorded in British colonial records as Purangir, Puranpuri, Purungir, Prawnpuri, the Gosai, etc., a recursive retelling of his story also becomes the narrative of disassembling the grand colonial historiographic exercise. So now let's come to Purangiri's first expedition to Tibet. Purangiri's biography needs to be reconstructed from three sources. First, from British colonial accounts such as the letters and diaries of George Bogle. George Bogle's dates are 1746 to 1781. This is the tomb of Bogle. He died in Calcutta. He died pretty young. He was a Scotsman, and he's buried at the South Park Street Cemetery. So the three sources of reconstructing Purangiri's biography, from British colonial accounts, such as the letters and diaries of George Bogle, 1746 to 1781, and the narratives of Samuel Turner and Clements Markham. The second source of constructing biography are the accounts of Bengalis like Gaurdash Boshak in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and Shushobhan Sarkar's article, A Note on Purangir Gosai, which was published also, in Bengal, past and present. And the third, as I mentioned, are the Tibetan hagiographies or the Namthars. I have also greatly relied on Kate Tesler's narrativized rendering of the Bogle mission. If you want, Kate Tesler, her book, The High Road to China, that is the book to refer to when one thinks of the Bogle mission, because she kind of creates this historiographic, almost fictionalized account, but very, very detailed and, from the archives of the Bogle mission, 1774-1777 Bogle mission to Tibet. So if you want, Kate Tetchler's book, High Road to China, is a very, very sort of important book when talking about the Bogle mission. And, I have also relied a great deal on Tetchler's own notes and sort of her footnotes to the book. The story of Giri's life was pieced together by Gaurdash Boshak 100 years after his death, in large parts from oral narratives. Giri was born a Brahmin, but being a mendicant sannyasi, he had discarded his sacrificial thread. Giri was initiated at a young age as a Dasnami at Joshimath and walked with a dandi, a large stick characteristic of his ascetic status. He is described as being tall, strong, and sinewy, and garbed in a kopinno, or a short red ochre dyed piece of cloth wrapped around his loins. He often had a tiger's skin thrown over his shoulders, although on certain public occasions he wore a kind of toga and covered his head with a turban. He is also described as being a strict vegetarian, a frugal eater, and a good horse rider. Shushabon Sharkar's account of Giri is largely a reworking of Gordash Boshak's essay. Sharkar conjectures that the first name was clearly Purno or Purna. Sharkar writes of the Goshais as the chief agents in the trans-Himalayan trade of Bengal, and many of them traversed distant lands on pilgrimages combined with commercial journeys. Now, Warren Hastings first met Giri on 29th March 1774. Now, we are coming to the British part of the story. How did Hastings meet Giri, and how did the Bogle mission happen? Okay, so Hastings first met Giri on 29th March 1774. The occasion of this meeting takes us back to 1771-1773, when a territorial dispute arose between Bhutan and Kuch Bihar, where the British had their troops stationed in the service of the Raja of Kuch Bihar. This dispute had resulted in the almost complete stalling of the available mountain passes from Tibet through Bhutan to British Bengal. The Panchen Lama, the same third Panchen Lama, Lobsang Palden Yeshe, in 1771, he received an embassy with gifts and presents from the Dugdeshi Raja, or the Bhutan, the Raja, or the Zidhar, as he was called in Tibetan sources, requesting an intervention to resolve this territorial dispute with the Kuch Bihar Maharaja. The Panchen Lama then sent Purangiri as an emissary in the company of a Tibetan named Pema as his messenger to Warren Hastings with a letter and a request to intercede. So the Panchen Lama sent Purangiri as his emissary at the request of the Dugdeshi Raja, or the Bhutanese Raja, and asking Warren Hastings to intervene. Where was I? Sorry. The Lama's letter, which reached Hastings on 29th March, mentions Purangiri, a Gosai, as its bearer, who would represent to you all particulars of the case. And, some of this is based on the materials which I have reconstructed from the British Library sources. You have the Bogle and the Warren Hastings part of the story, George Bogle and Warren Hastings part of the story. That's very easily available from the British colonial records, which one finds in the British Library. Giri is noted to have left a deep impression on Hastings, in whose mind was awakened the grand design of opening up the whole area north of the Himalayas to British trade and influence. Hastings' response was quick, seeing this as an opportunity to open a mutual and equal communication of trade between the inhabitants of Tibet and Bengal. He negotiated a treaty with Bhutan on 25th April 1774, through which the Bhutanese were allowed to visit a tax-free annual trade fair at Rangpur. Hastings also wrote to the Board of Control of the company with his views on the need, I quote, to establish an intercourse with Tibet, and recommending that the young Scotsman, George Bogle, be allowed to head a mission to the Tashi Lama in Tibet. In May 1774, a British envoy was thus dispatched to Tibet via Bhutan, headed by George Bogle as Hastings' deputy to the Tashi Lama, and accompanied by the surgeon Alexander Hamilton, an old family friend of Bogle and a fellow Scot. They went to Shigatse, Tibet, to the court of the third Panchen Lama. And of course, their guide was none other than Purangiri. Bogle's account was later reproduced by Clements Markham in 1876. Kate Techla, I just mentioned her and her book, has refashioned this account from British colonial records and Bogle's own profuse notes and correspondence. Now, Techla describes, she writes that, I'm quoting her, tutored by Purangir, Bogle managed to enter into surprisingly close relations with the Panchen Lama. Techla, in her investigation of the impetus that undercut the British interest in Tibet in the 18th century, describes an East India Company on the verge of insolvency and greatly dependent on the import of tea from Canton in China, keen on using the figure of the Panchen Lama to find an inroad to the Qing Emperor for the purpose of establishing a direct trade link. Now, this question comes up, why were the British interested, at least in Warren Hastings' time, why was the East India Company interested in Tibet? And Techla is conjecturing that the possible reason is to import tea directly from China, from the Qing Emperor. Remember, this is before Darjeeling. Darjeeling is only grabbed from Sikkim 100 years later. Regarding what may have driven Hastings, Schuler-Kamen opines that a part of the East India Company's insolvency that resulted in them looking northward of the Himalayas for developing new forms of commerce may be due to the Great Famine of 1770, which caused enormous financial losses, especially in the export of grain and in the cotton industry, on which the economy of Bengal so much depended. Hastings also had a personal interest in Tibet, fueled by his natural curiosity about unusual places and things, and also corroborated by there being in his possession a map of Tibet that had been made by the French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville. My French, I can't speak French, so pardon my pronunciation. As both Giri and Pema possessed an acute understanding and ready information of the terrain north of the Himalayas, Hastings was keen on deploying this knowledge, the knowledge of Purangiri, in the service of the East India Company. The missionary Samuel Louis Graham Sandburg, 1851 to 1905, who had been sent to India in 1885, in his bid to credit Hastings as the first white statesman who designed the establishment of friendly relations with the Grand Lamas of Lhasa and Tashilumpo, he often conflates the figures of Purangiri and Panchal Lama. Now, this is just an aside, not so much important to our story, so I'll just skip this part. This is basically Graham Sandburg, who is the missionary figure who, he's Purangiri becomes so inconsequential later that, his own writing goes missing. You don't find it. There's mention of it, but you don't find his own writing in Devanagari. So his story has to be entirely reconstructed from colonial accounts and from the Tibetan Namthars. And you will see how important a figure he is in the sense of, it is through him that the Bhot Bagaan monastery comes up with, which I began this talk, and I'll come to the monastery itself. So, Graham Sandburg, he is almost conflating, not almost, he's conflating the figure of Purangiri with the Panchal Lama. So, he becomes so inconsequential, whereas it is through him that Warren Hastings had managed to, open up, quote unquote, open up this inroad into Tibet. So, Bogle's mission traveled from Kuch Bihar to Bhutan, where in June 1774, Bogle found himself stranded for a few months and unable to proceed to Tibet. The Tashi Lama sent a messenger with a letter to Bogle in July 1774, informing that the Qing emperor had forbade the admission of Mughals, Hindustanis, Pathans, and Europeans, Firingis, and urging Bogle to return to Calcutta. So he was on the verge of being sent back from Bhutan. The Tashi Lama sent a letter saying that please don't come because the Qing emperor of China has forbidden the admission of Mughals, Hindustanis, Pathans, and Europeans, Firingis. It seems from the Tibetan Namthar, however, that pilgrims, monks, and traveling ascetics such as the Gosais were not under any such sort of proscription. They could pass freely between Tibet and India, or what was the Indian kingdoms. So Purangiri and Pema set out for Bhutan on 16 July 1774, bearing letters from Bogle and the king of Bhutan to the Panchen Lama in an attempt to negotiate Bogle's entry. Giri, as cultural mediator, managed to effectuate this, and Bogle received a confirmation through a letter dispatched to the Bhutanese king by the Panchen Lama that he was now awaiting the arrival of Bogle and Hamilton at the borders of Tibet. So you see, when he was stuck in Bhutan, George Bogle was stuck in Bhutan, he and Alexander Hamilton, it was Purangiri who negotiated through his earlier links with the third Panchen Lama, Bogle's entry into Tibet. The Panchen Lama would also send out another person called Sukhdev Giri. We have already, heard about him before, as someone who had long been known in Tibet and had brought many manufacturers and valuable commodities of Hindustan to assist Bogle in his journey to Tibet from Bhutan. Bogle was under instructions from Hastings to attempt to wean away the Panchen Lama from his dependency on China and in favor of the British. So this was the main sort of reason why the mission was sent. He had to wean away the Panchen Lama, the third Panchen Lama, from his influence, from him being influenced by the Qing Emperor of China, and make him into a pro-British figure. The mission set out from Tashilung, Bhutan on 13th October and reached Tashilumpo on 12th November 1774. Bogle had several audiences with the Panchen Lama and remained in Tashilumpo till 7th April 1775. Finally reaching Kuch Bihar in early June. The Tibetan source reveals some resistance to the presence of Europeans at Tashilumpo, by Kishan Puri, the ambassador of the Banaras Raja, as well as the Lhasa regent, Gesab Rinpoche. It may be important here to question how the mission itself has continued to be referred to by contemporary historians. All of them keep talking about it as the Bogal mission, Bogal mission. Now, whenever one talks of Tibet, the Bogal mission is the first moment of Anglo-Tibetan encounter. So how it has been referred to by contemporary historians as the Bogal mission, whereas it was a mission that relied heavily on multiple agents and actors, most important among these being Purangiri. Bogle himself acknowledged the Gosai's role as a cultural broker and also his own constant requirement of an interpreter. But Bogle couldn't speak Tibetan. However, the circumscription of Giri's presence within and orchestrating of the mission goes to the extent of his near complete erasure from British colonial accounts that reduce him to an almost untraceable figure lurking in the archival shadows. This overwriting of Giri's agency as knowledge subject, as an itinerant sannyasi who was able to traverse between and mediate through these porous religious and pilgrimage networks in the Himalayas by British colonial historiography, itself becomes symbolic of the larger absorption within a white Anglo-centric early discourse of knowledge-making and historiography, the eclectic kinds of indigenous or autochthonous knowledges that were deeply embedded within the religio-cultural topolect of the Himalayan region. So this is exactly how, the whole idea of an Anglophonic white colonial historiography is constructed based on archival erasures, absences, and near complete effacement of the voice of the native agents and their autochthonous indigenous agency. While it was a desire for bringing the trans-Himalayan trade routes within British influence that had pushed Hastings, for the Panchen Lama, now a question might come up that, okay, fine, Hastings is a whole, the impetus on Hastings' part is clear, but what motivated the Panchen Lama? Okay, just give me a second, please. While it was a desire for bringing the trans-Himalayan trade routes within British influence that had pushed Hastings, for the Panchen Lama, what was foremost was the possibility of reclaiming the sacred site of Bodh Gaya through an opening up of a new pilgrimage network through British India. As seen from the Tibetan sources, the Lama had already been sending his monks to the Mahabodhi temple. I was just talking about one of his earlier emissaries called Lobsang. The Lama had been sending his monks to the Mahabodhi temple site and also to the court of Chaitsing. We have seen all that. In his letter to Hastings via Bogle, the third Panchen Lama would put in a request which needs to be quoted in full here. This letter is from the archival British Library, the archival sources. I'm quoting the Lama's letter as translated into English from Tibetan. And it's important to read this letter out aloud. I am induced to request that you will grant me a piece of ground near the seaside that may build a house of worship thereupon, and for the expenses of building it, I have sent 100 pieces of gold via Mr. Bogle, together with some carpets, cloths, and other necessaries, which he will show you for the decoration of it. And I request that you will do me the favor to let the house be immediately built and things put up. And as soon as the cold season sets in, I will certainly dispatch to you some of my own people, just a second. Just give me a second. I lost the place I was reading. I'm sorry about the pause. Yes, sorry about that. I will certainly dispatch to you some of my own people, if not some of the family of the Lama, who is patron of the Emperor of China. I hope that you will receive them with kindness and send some of your own servants with them to visit every place of worship at Allahabad, Banaras, etc. for discharge of religious duties. Now, the Lama sent a request through Bogle to Hastings of setting up a guest house and a monastery. And the whole idea was basically, from the third Panchen Lama's perspective, it was basically to be able to rekindle the pilgrimage networks in India. The Lama would once again personally impress upon Bogle this request when the latter was in Tashilhunpo in April 1775, adding that about 700 or 800 years ago, the Tibetan pontiffs had many monasteries in Bengal, and their monks would travel into that country often to study the religion and language. It was the Panchen Lama's great wish to see this network revitalized, an act that Bogle inferred would throw great lustre on his pontificate and serve to extend his fame and character. If he can, after so long an interval, obtain a religious establishment in Bengal. Hastings saw the Panchen Lama's request of monastery as an immediate opportunity for securing commercial ties with Tibet. So Hastings was thinking trade, the Lama was thinking pilgrimage. But Hastings lost no time in acquiring 100 bighas of land on the banks of the Hooghly in Howrah on 12 June 1778 and leasing it tax-free to the Lama. Here he deposited all the items that had been sent by the Lama and arranged for the observance of the necessary ceremonies that would serve to expand your fame in this country. Okay, the 1923 second issue, and later we will see that these lands, just give me a second. Yeah, these lands, the 100 bighas of lands, were basically acquired from Rajchand Roy, Kali Prasad Roy, and Raghunath Deb, and the transfer was made to Purangir as agent, I quote, agent of Maharaja Tashi Lama for a house and garden in their taluk. And in the official records, the Lama never comes to India. The third Panchen Lama never comes to India. He dies a little after this. And he wanted Purangiri to be the talukdar. That's the word used, to be the talukdar of this monastery, which came up on the site of the Ganges, which is the Bhot Bagaan monastery, which is in ruins today. A great monastery thus came up at Bhot Bagaan, the first of its kind in British India, and Giri became at the Panchen Lama's behest its talukdar or custodian, so that he could execute the business and prepare and finish whatever is necessary for the house of worship. The guest house associated with the monastery was purported to act as a transit during winter months for monks from Tibet undertaking the journey to the Mahabodhi shrine and other sacred sites in India. He also gave the figure of the Mahakal, the 10-headed Mahakal, which was stolen, retrieved, and now, I spoke to one of she is now retired curators of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. The Mahakala idol, which was the main idol, which was housed in the monastery that was stolen, retrieved and stolen again. So now it is apparently in some local police vault in Howrah, and Bandana Mukherjee, I know her quite well. She was a Tibetan expert, specialist of Tibetan collections at the Asiatic Society. She also told me that she had actually seen the idol in one of the police vaults in Howrah. And what is now kind of the main idol is the Pragya Paramita, which I had already shown you. This was given as a secondary image by the third Panchen Lama to Purangiri, to Hastings, to be housed in the monastery, and this is now the central image at the site, the only trace that remains of this encounter. Yeah. Just give me a second. After this, Purangiri would go on a second expedition to Tibet, but Bogle would die. So Hastings planned for a second British expedition to Tibet with Bogle in April 1779. Bogle himself had plans of meeting the Panchen Lama in Peking. It was Purangiri instead who went to Tibet once again in 1778 and accompanied the Lama to Peking in 1779. Now, this account was translated by Samuel Turner of the Lama's journey to Peking, and it was Purangiri who went alone. Bogle did not go. Bogle had his most untimely death on 3rd April 1781 in Calcutta due to fever and was interred. We have just seen his tomb at the South Park Street Cemetery. That's Bogle's tomb. Purangiri had been the only non-Tibetan, Europeans being excluded at the time, and meanwhile the Tashi Lama also died. Sorry, the Panchen Lama, the third Panchen Lama, he died of smallpox in July 1779. So both Bogle and the third Panchen Lama died, and Purangiri was the only one who was allowed to attend the cremation ritual of the Tashi Lama or the Panchen Lama. Giri returned to Hastings on 12 February 1782. Hastings continued his communication through Purangiri and with the Panchen Lama's monastic regent at Tashilhunpo Monastery in Shigatse. Okay, now when the Dalai Lama or the Panchen Lama, they enter, they pass on, and before the next reincarnation can be selected, the responsibilities are passed on to the agent. So after the third Panchen Lama, Lobsang Palden Yeshi, died, and before a new incarnation could be selected, an agent would be in charge of the Tashilhunpo Monastery in Shigatse. Through Hastings, for a while, carried on his messages and interactions to the regent through Purangiri. An additional 50 bighas of land was acquired for the Bhot Bagaan monastery from Raja Navakrishna Dev of Shobhavachar Rajbari and Raja Rajchand Rai of Andul Rajbari, and leased to the Tashi Lama through Giri on 11 February 1783. Another official mission to Tibet was sent from Bengal on 9 January 1783, headed by Captain Samuel Turner. Now, Turner's mission to Tibet came after Bogle died, and basically, I'm not going into the details of the mission. Purangiri would once again go with Samuel Turner as the emissary, the interpreter, and Samuel Turner basically went to meet the young reincarnated Panchen Lama, and to be able to communicate the prospect of, this a link had been established between Tibet and British Bengal. So to be able to continue this link, he went and met the young the reincarnated Panchen Lama, and with the message with message from Warren Hastings. Okay, so I'm not going into the details of Turner's mission, which came after Bogle, but Purangiri was also the interpreter and the main kind of guide who facilitated, the cultural interlocutor who facilitated Turner's mission. There was one final expedition of Purangiri to Tibet towards the end of his Indian period of service. Prior to his resignation, we know that Warren Hastings resigned in 1785, and this was followed by his impeachment. Hastings decided to send Purangiri once again to Tibet as his representative to the young Panchen Lama. Purangiri commenced his solo mission to Tibet from Calcutta, this is after Turner's mission, in March 1785. On Giri's return, Turner put together a report in the form of a letter from Giri's verbatim account. Giri left Tashilhunpo in October, so it's in 1785 that Giri undertakes a solo mission to Tibet. Giri also brought letters addressed to Hastings from the new reincarnated Panchen Lama, whose name was Lobsang Palden Tenpai Nima. In 1775, meanwhile, a series of incidents will happen which will result in the severance of ties between British Bengal and Tibet. In 1775, Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Oudh, ceded its suzerainty over Banaras to the East India Company, greatly curtailing the powers of Raja Chait Singh. This foreclosed the sending of the Goshais as religious emissaries into Tibet. Newer disputes arose meanwhile between the Himalayan kingdoms, which eventually saw the involvement of Imperial China. Additionally, British interference within the affairs of the kingdoms of Nepal and Sikkim resulted in the emergence of newer power politics in the Himalayas and brought about a newer kind of power restructuring. As a result of British proximity to Sikkim and later to Nepal, the Qing Chinese monarch decreed eventually that all Tibetan passes to Bhutan be sealed, and the Chinese also banned the pilgrimage of Indian sannyasis to Tibet for fear of them being British spies.
Just a second. Some people have been telling me slides ta dekha jacche na, to slide ki dekha jacche? Ekটু যদি বাকিরা বলবেন যে স্লাইড শোটা কি দেখা যাচ্ছে?
আমি তো দেখতে পাচ্ছি।
এখন তো টম্ব অফ পুরনগিরিটা দেখাচ্ছেন, পুরো তো কানেক্টেডই আছে।
ওইটাই আছে।
তাহলে আই থিংক দেখা যাচ্ছে। ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
Okay, sure. Thanks Kush. Okay. So yeah, as I was saying, basically, because of British proximity to and British interference rather in Nepal and Sikkim, which will take us in a different direction, eventually the Qing monarch of China decreed that all mountain passes be closed. Chait Singh's powers were curtailed because of he lost his suzerainty to the Nawab of Oudh, and basically, this linkage was cut off, and Warren Hastings himself went back, to England, and the third Panchen Lama died. So, what had begun as this very interesting exchange encounter between British Bengal and Tibet, that was completely cut off for 100 years. In the spring of 1795, the monastery was attacked by dacoits, As consignees of material cultural exchange between Tibet and India, the Dasnami sannyasis would often trade in Tibetan gold dust for mercantile exchanges Bengal. The monastery at the time had acquired a local reputation for being a storehouse of gold. Raids by dacoits had become common at the time due to the Great Famine of the 1790s. Purangiri died defending the monastery from the dacoits after a brief but valiant sword fight with them. This is the story that, he tried to defend his beloved monastery. He was the talukdar of it anyway, from the dacoits, and ultimately he succumbed. Okay. And, there is also this story which Boshak, his biographer, records from oral narratives that the British were so angry. Hastings had gone back to England by that time. The then Governor General John Shore was so angry that, he was a very important kind of cultural interlocutor for the British, that when these dacoits were caught, they were hanged from poles in front of the monastery itself. That's how the story goes from oral narratives. Purangiri had maintained a diary of his extensive travel. The diary is never heard of again. The public body papers of the Office of the Home Department in 1790 mentioned this diary, which was deposited with the board. And the original diary was written in Devanagari. Okay, it's never heard of again. I have looked up British Library sources. I couldn't trace the diary. One doesn't know where it went. It's completely, and Tesla also does not mention anything about encountering this diary. So, it's never heard of again. This is Purangiri's tomb at the site of Bhot Bagaan, with a Shivalinga that was erected over it, and a Bengali inscription which records the date on which he died as May 3, 1795. I photographed this when I visited the site in 2017. Okay. The later Giris of Bhot Bagaan and the severance of links with Tibet. Boshak, Gurdas Boshak, the biographer, records how important the monastery under Purangiri was from a historical point of view, being the first site from where trade and other forms of negotiations began with Tibet. Giri was for the British an invaluable resource that could be exploited when need be to forge trade liaisons with the Himalayan kingdoms, especially with Tibet. Following his death, however, we just discussed how he was murdered by dacoits. The Bhot Bagaan monastery passed into the hands of a series of Dasnami Saivite Mahants. As per the Dasnami tradition, Purangiri was buried in a sitting position at the tomb within the monastery by his disciple and successor, Daljit Giri. Over his samadhi, a Shivlinga was erected and the first Shiva temple of the current enclave was built. The date of consecration of his tomb, as I mentioned, is May 3rd, 1795, with a Bengali inscription over it erected by Daljit Giri, Purangiri's disciple, who became the second Mohanto of the shrine. Boshak refers in his article to this tomb, which bears an inscription in the Bengali language and character, and states that this belonged to the late Purangiri Mahant. After Purangiri's death, Daljit Giri served as the Mahant for 43 years before his death on 6th March 1243, roughly corresponding to January-February 1838. He was succeeded by Kaligiri Goshai, who dismantled most of the existing structure of Bhot Bagaan monastery and built a Shiva temple on the site. This is the picture which I'm showing you. The main shrine now, whatever remains of it, is a later reconstruction. At the time of the successor of Daljit Giri, his name was, as I said, Kaligiri Goshai. He dismantled most of the existing Tibetan structure and built a Shiva temple on the site. The present monument that stands today dates to the time of Kaligiri Goshai. After the death of Kaligiri, a debate vis-a-vis succession of the next Mohanto broke out between Bilasgiri and Umraugiri. Umraugiri served as an associate Mohanto till the death of Bilasgiri before becoming the full-fledged Mohanto of the Mott. Okay, it's very interesting. I'm not getting into the details of the Mohantos, but one of them was also involved in a lengthy court case. Okay, there was this charge against him in court, and this is one of the inscription in Bangla, which is there at the site and records the historical importance of the site. Okay. It was renamed as Sri Shankar Mott because they're Dashnami sannyasis, and the connection with Tibet has been completely severed but after Purangiri. So it was almost like the site becomes a Shaivite site after that. these are some of the tombs of the later Giri Mohantos. They all have Shivalingas housed in them, and they're built in the Archala style. Okay. When I visited in 2017, that's when I was like writing my thesis, and this is not the first chapter of my thesis, of course. I've reworked it on it later, but this is I found boys playing cricket, and they use the grounds for games basically. And this is one of Bengal Heritage Commission kind of notice, which is there on this site, also photographed by me. Not much of it remains. This is the state of the site basically right now. The upper quarters are like this. And this is actually the only trace that remains of the encounter between the third Panchan Lama and Purangiri is the figure of Pragyaparamita or Jetsun Rolma. If Purangiri's biography, as reconstructed from colonial period accounts, provides one entry point into interrogating the earliest encounter between the British Indian Empire and Tibet, the physical monument of Bhot Bagaan itself bears its material trace and stands as the only surviving historical remnant of that encounter. Goldash Boshak describes the mott or monastery as having initially been constructed in the Tibetan style, although he writes that subsequent constructions have made it immensely difficult to mark out the site as specifically Tibetan. 100 years after Purangiri's death, when Goldash Boshak visited the site, he writes, "There is nothing at present known which can show how much was originally built and when and by whom subsequent additions were made. It cannot, however, be questioned that the portion closest to the river presents those peculiarities which might be looked for in a structure built under Tibetan influence." And this was in 1891 when Boshak was visiting the site. So imagine this is 2024. So precious little remains of it. Please give me a second. Presently, apart from the figures of the Tibetan Buddhist deities placed within the shrine, and there are a few deities which are below the Pragyaparamita, smaller idols. And I told you the Mahakala idol was stolen, and according to one of the retired sort of senior researchers of the Asiatic Society, can be found in a police vault in Howrah. Presently, apart from the figures of the Tibetan Buddhist deities placed within the shrine, there are no stylistic or architectural idioms that remotely suggest the site's Tibetan link. The main shrine is surmounted by a symbol of Shiva's trident. I showed you this image. Yeah. A signature mark of the Tarokeshwar Mondali of the Snami Saivites, who were the successive Mahants of the site. Let me come to the kind of concluding section of this paper. Do I have around 5 more minutes to go?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't want to bore you much longer. So let me just quickly kind of talk about the repercussions of this whole story, which I just narrated. How do we thus begin to address the story of the loss and recovery of Purangiri's role and agency and the narrative of Bhot Bagaan's history and its afterlife? As scholars have conjectured, the early colonial interest in Tibet remained predominantly structured around trade, one through which the British sought to have some modicum of imperial control over the existing trans-Himalayan trade routes. Throughout the 18th century, although the primary early colonial interest in Tibet remained one of trade, the networks of linkages initiated by the third Panchan Lama and Hastings through Bogle and later Turner, and facilitated by Purangiri, brought about an effective return of Tantric Buddhism to the land of its birth. Following the departure of Hastings and the death of Lobsang Palin Yeshe, the third Panchan Lama, and later of Purangiri, the links to Tibet would be severed for another 100 years, and the Bhot Bagaan monument would slowly disappear from public memory. Nonetheless, this early moment needs to be positioned within a religious and discursive configuration of Bengal's Buddhist past. An entry point into interrogating this past is the physical monument itself, although now in near complete disrepair, and the image of Pragyaparamita housed therein. Both the Bhot Bagaan monument as well as the image of Pragyaparamita housed within it, become the living material embodiment of a reimagination of Bengal's Tantric Buddhist heritage in the 18th century. Another entry point into looking at this past is the extraordinary and almost forgotten biography of Purangiri himself, who was the British Empire's primary early link to Tibet and served as interpreter, messenger, negotiator, and cultural broker. Although his biography has to be almost entirely reconstructed from colonial period accounts, Giri remains the pivotal go-between, a cultural broker capable of navigating several languages and a disparate set of cultures: Hindustani, Nepali, Tibetan. None of the later Mahants or Mahantos of Bhot Bagaan could take on such a mantle of cultural brokerage, and with the severance of links with Tibet, and additionally in the absence of British colonial patronage, the site gradually transformed, both in terms of architectural idiom as well as modalities of worship, becoming an overwhelmingly Hindu site with little link to Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. So, through this story, what we also see, and this is a point which I've been kind of trying to harp on, it's not just a story about Hastings and the third Panchen Lama and Purangiri, but also about how prior to the British reimagination of Buddhism in India, and we are aware of Alexander Cunningham's, whole kind of excavation of the Buddhist sites in Sanchi and the Bodh Gaya investment and all of that. But even before the British kind of reconfiguration of India's Buddhist heritage, there were prior links, as we have seen, and the Tibetan sources, the Namthars or the hagiographies, become ways of reconstructing stories. So when the British kind of use the Gosais as cultural mediators, there are earlier networks of exchange, as we have seen, between the courts of some of the Indian monarchs, right, like Chet Singh and the Tibetan, the Panchen Lama, the third Panchen Lama. And it's sort of then becomes an important early moment of encounter, and the site becomes the only material cultural trace of this history, especially the figure of Pragyaparamita, the central idol, becomes the material cultural trace and an entry point into looking at this history. So I will stop there, and then maybe if there are questions, we can kind of take it up and discuss this further. Thank you so much once again for having me and for giving me the space to deliver, to talk about my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shen, for such a rigorous and, if I may say, information-packed presentation. That was really quite a journey, and a very hectic journey for someone like me, who is coming from the economics background. I was just struggling to grasp the concepts, but I'm sure because Kush has already raised a hand, so there will be a lot of questions, and the floor is now open. So Kush, I think we can start with your question.
Thank you, Parjanya. I have a question and I have a what if. Okay, I'll ask the question first, which is, what was Purnagiri's reason to go to Tibet? If you could sort of elaborate on it, because